I don't know. I'm not over it, but there's something.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Tanya Zanish-Belcher, Director of Special Collections and Archives. I like how I had to look down at the paper to make sure what my name was. On behalf of the Z. Smith Reynolds Library, we are pleased to host a presentation by Dr. Andrew Canady titled Deacon Chronicles, Researching and Writing the History of Wake Forest College. Sponsored by Wake Forest, Dr. Canady began working on this project in 2017. Some logistical information to start. Dr. Canady will be speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which there will be time for questions. We then invite you to join us for a reception next door in room 403. This presentation is being live streamed. It will be recorded and then made available on our YouTube channel. Special thanks to Rebecca Peterson-May, Public Services Archivist, for coordinating the reception. Thanks to Special Collections team members for assisting. And thanks, as always, to Barry Davis for coordinating our technical needs. Andrew McNeill Canady received his BA in 2003 from Wake Forest with a double major in History and Religion, and his MA and Ph.D. from Rice University. He is currently an Associate Professor of History and Chair, Department of History, Political Science, and Religion at Averett University in Danville, Virginia. His book, Willis Duke Weatherford, Race, Religion, and Reform in the American South, was published by the University of Kentucky Press in 2019. Andrew, all yours.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak today. Is that picking up? Okay. As many of you may know, a good deal has been written about Wake Forest history. The first to provide an extensive study was George Washington Pascal. He was a brief professor at Wake Forest in the early 1900s. In 1935, he published his first volume, which covered Wake Forest from its start through the Civil War. About a decade later, Pascal published 2 additional volumes, bringing the story of Wake Forest history up through the early 1940s. In total, his 3 volumes comprise nearly 1,800 pages. Many people don't read them because of that. And there have been other histories that have been written about Wake Forest beyond the period covered by Pascal. Bynum Shaw published the history of Wake Forest for the years 1943 to 1967. More recently, Ed Wilson wrote a history of the university during the Scales administration, and Sam Gladding wrote a history of the Hearn years. What I've been asked to do is write a 1-volume history of Wake Forest that places the school in the context of American history, and that particularly delves into the school's relationship with slavery and racism. My project begins with the background and founding of Wake Forest, and it ends in 1956 with the move of the college to Winston-Salem. In effect, this work will be a re-examination of the years in which Pascal and Shaw wrote about. The work will be peer-reviewed and published by University Press. What I'd like to do with my time today is sketch some of Wake Forest history from its founding through the early 1900s, providing some of my findings, and also giving particular attention to the period after the Civil War. As many of you may know, a good bit of interest has been in looking in the antebellum history of Wake Forest. I will cover some of that information certainly, but I also want to provide some information about what happens in that post-Civil War era. So, the school first known as Wake Forest Institute, it opened in 1834, and it was opened on the former plantation of Calvin Jones. Originally from Massachusetts, Jones was a medical doctor who came to North Carolina in the late 1700s. Jones went on to marry into a wealthy farming and slaveholding family in North Carolina. Soon, looking for a place to put his enslaved workers to use, he purchased, quote, Wake Forest, a plantation of property of approximately 615 acres in 1821. He paid $4,000. However, Jones also began to invest in land in Tennessee in the coming years with hopes of relocating there. Throughout the 1820s, he tried to sell his Wake Forest plantation on several occasions, but with no success. 1830. A small group of white Baptists in North Carolina who were interested in supporting missions and the education of ministers, they organized the Baptist State Convention. Over the previous decade, Baptists in some neighboring states like South Carolina and Virginia had done the same thing. As this denomination was trying to raise its status at the time and pull together for mission projects and educational programs. The convention soon developed their own schools to train Baptist ministers. One of the first was Furman in South Carolina in the late 1820s. Until this time, most Baptist preachers in the South lacked formal education. In North Carolina, the Baptist State Convention, like its counterparts in Georgia, South Carolina, and Virginia, they soon decided to start a school of their own that would help train Baptist ministers in their state. In 1832, as they were looking for a site for the school, several of their representatives purchased Wake Forest for $2,000 from Calvin Jones. Effectively, Jones sold for a lower price because he wanted to move to Tennessee, where he had much larger land holdings. Soon he and his family relocated to Tennessee, taking along with them approximately 40 enslaved men, women, and children. The plantation he left behind, which included his home, 7 slave cabins, and various outbuildings, they became the new site of the Baptist school. What was known as Wake Forest Institute, it lasted for 5 years. During the time of the Institute, the school operated a farm on the plantation, requiring the young men and boys that attended to complete several hours of manual labor each day. Manual labor schools were a fad at the time, and many other schools like Mercer as well as Furman, they had experimented with this feature. Wake Forest also ran a stewards department that handled providing meals and washing for students and faculty. From the start, the school rented enslaved black people for agricultural work and to cook, wash, and perform other domestic tasks at the school. This practice of renting enslaved workers from slave owners was a common thing in the South. The renter effectively paid the slave owner for the enslaved person's time. Wake Forest was not alone in this practice of renting enslaved labor, as many other schools, and I could give a long list here, but the University of North Carolina, William and Mary, the University of Virginia, Mercer, Furman, all did the same in this period. For Wake Forest's first year, an early account book, it shows that there were 4 enslaved African Americans who were rented to do work on the campus. Their names were listed as Ellick, Harry, and wife. We do not have her last name, it was simply listed as wife, and a woman by the name of Charlotte. So the first year there were 4. As the school grew over the next few years, that number increased significantly. In 1835, they rented 13, and in 1836, 16. Rented enslaved workers in this period would have experienced a difficult circumstance in a college setting. At Wake Forest and many other southern schools, many students came from slaveholding families, and they likely felt very entitled to command these enslaved workers to do their bidding. This reality gave these rented enslaved workers multiple masters which to contend. Rented enslaved workers would also have been separated from family during the renting contract. Renting contracts typically were for 1 year, usually starting in early January, but they could also be for shorter periods like a week or 3 weeks. Most of the renting contracts I've been able to determine at Wake Forest appear to be on the yearly scale. There was an instance early in the school's history where they rented extra enslaved workers for the week of July 4th as they celebrated 4th of July. The choice to rent enslaved people rather than own was not made by Wake Forest trustees because of moral objections to owning. Instead, renting was more flexible to Wake Forest needs and financially a more feasible option. In 1839, after several years in operation, the trustees made several significant decisions about the school. They dropped the manual labor program. They rechartered the school as Wake Forest College, and they created a town out of the plantation. Without the manual labor program, Wake Forest rented fewer enslaved black people because the school at that point did not need agricultural laborers. Wake Forest also ended their stewards department fairly soon after that. That had been providing meals and doing washing for students and faculty. And so in that case, there also became less need for enslaved people to do domestic work. But in the village of Wake Forest, surrounding the school as it developed, you soon had boarding houses, places where students could go get their meals, and some even took a room there. The owners of all these boarding houses, many of them who were faculty or local white residents, they were slaveholders. And they would have used their enslaved workers to cook, wash, and clean for students. Before emancipation, all of Wake Forest presidents were slaveholders, as were many of his faculty and trustees. Along with enslaved black people, Wake Forest also employed some free black people in the antebellum period to work on campus. North Carolina had a sizable free black population, amounting to something like 30,000 by the 1860 census. At Wake Forest, I am certain of at least one man who is a free black person, and his name was Green Evans. The census records also clearly indicate his status. There's two other men that are in the account records from this period. The names, you get different spellings, but it's Bill Pierce or Bill Peace, and then Ralph Pierce. These men also were likely free blacks that worked at Wake Forest, but Wake Forest, they never indicate the status, whether one is free or enslaved. Usually, they're using a word like servant to indicate whoever this worker is. Between 1839 and the Civil War, both enslaved workers and free blacks were referred to in college records as, quote, college servants. Wake Forest even charged students, this was listed in their catalog, a servant's hire fee at the time as part of students' annual educational cost. This amounted to $1 or $2 each year. Those workers would have swept buildings, brought in firewood and water, took out ashes. This is a time when the buildings are heated by fires and fireplaces. They would clean classrooms, made student beds, rang the college bell, and did a variety of other tasks. When the Civil War began in the spring of 1861, Wake Forest quickly found itself affected. The week after North Carolina seceded from the United States, Wake Forest ended its semester early. By that point, many students had already enlisted in the Confederate Army, and others were itching to leave and join. Wake Forest remained open for only one more year before they suspended their operations. And during the war, the Confederate government requisitioned the campus, and for a period, they operated a hospital in the one building on campus at the time, known as the College Building. Overall, during the Civil War, many current and former Wake Forest students, as well as faculty, would serve in the Confederate military. In the years of operation before Wake Forest closed in 1862, roughly 1,100 people had attended, matriculated as students. However, only a small portion actually received a degree. The one degree then would have been the Bachelor of Arts degree. 119 completed the bachelor's degree. Indeed, many students at the time just went for a period of time to college, probably never intending to get a degree, instead hoping that taking a certain amount of college training, it would have meant something at that point. Ironically, while the primary reason the Baptist State Convention had created the school was to help train ministers of their denomination, Wake Forest ended up producing a much larger group of men who followed professions outside of the church. Of the students attending in that period, roughly 100 became ministers. Others became physicians, lawyers, teachers, farmers, professors, and journalists. Overall, during the period before the Civil War, Wake Forest generally had 4 or 5 professors. This is a small place. They would have taught approximately 90 students a year. The curriculum was set. You had no opportunity for a particular major. Everyone had the same set curriculum. Financial troubles plagued this school, though after the 1850s, this situation began to improve some. Throughout this time, there were some dedicated people committed to the institution. Records reveal that faculty, professors on a number of occasions, continued to do their work without having salaries paid. Some of the early professors at the school, they received land out of the original plantation for back due salaries. That's how some of them began to operate boarding house establishments soon after it became a college. They were given land. The school benefited from enslaved labor throughout this period. They also received several bequests from slave owners, including the Blunt Estate, where Wake Forest trustees sold 16 enslaved men, women, and children. Overall, Wake Forest and the village that grew up around the college were all bound up in this institution of slavery. Enslaved black people and a few free blacks provided the manual and domestic labor for the school that helped it to function and remain in operation, and in this process endured discrimination and exploitation. Wake Forest reopened in 1866 as a struggling college operating out of one main academic building with a little endowment, a handful of professors, and enrollment below 100 students. Over the next several decades, the college grew and changed its curriculum. By 1905, it was a much more financially sound institution spread across half a dozen buildings. They had 18 professors, they had a medical and law school, and they had reached 300 students as their enrollment. Throughout this time, as in the period before the Civil War, Wake Forest was a Baptist institution connected closely to North Carolina Baptist State Convention. In the immediate aftermath of the war, many of the faculty who taught at Wake Forest, they were former slaveholders and Confederate veterans. This pattern continued for coming decades, until another generation who would arrive, and many of those professors, they were the sons of slaveholders and former Confederate soldiers, as well as Southern Baptists. Pride in the Confederate cause remained strong at the college through the late 1800s, early 1900s. The lost cause mythology that would have downplayed the importance of slavery as a cause of the Civil War depicted the cause of the Confederacy as just and noble, and portrayed slavery as a benign institution, was alive and well at Wake Forest. At the college, the old racist and white supremacist views of students and faculty had not died with the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. Luther Rice Mills, he was a graduate of the class of 1861, and he had been a Confederate officer during the war. He returned to teach at the college soon after the war. He remained bitter about the Reconstruction period for years, and he had this to say about the political situation after the Civil War. Quote, "In 1868, many of our best citizens were not allowed to vote, while every Negro man who would swear that he was 21 years old was allowed to do so. The great majority of the members of the legislature elected were carpetbaggers and scalawags, and with few exceptions, the laws enacted during the session in 1869 were unwise, ill-timed, extravagant, and corrupt." Unquote. In another essay, he went on to make these further remarks, quote, "During those days, men in legislatures all over the South were bought and sold like cattle. The best men of the land were not allowed to vote. The mud seals and bottom rails were on top." Unquote. Mills failed to mention that many of what he called the best citizens and best men, by whom he would have meant white people, had been treasonous to the United States, and that was why they had been disenfranchised. Mills, however, was blind to that reality, and he fell into the myth of Reconstruction that many white Southerners would hold so tenaciously to well into the 20th century. His anger during this time even prompted him to contemplate violence. In one of the most chilling statements I've come across from a Wake Forest professor, Mills recalled a personal experience from the time of the 1870 Kirk-Holden War. This was a period when North Carolina's Governor William Holden had brought in a militia led by Colonel George Kirk to stop KKK violence in North Carolina. Here's what Mills said, quote, "While running the Biblical Recorder in Raleigh during my summer vacation, I passed the camp of Kirk's Negro troops 2 or 3 times a day on my way to and from the post office. I used to stop and wish for my Confederate sharpshooters that I commanded in 1864 and calculate how long it would take me to run the whole battalion out of camp." End quote. I should add that that particular quote comes from an article that Mills wrote that was published in the Wake Forest Bulletin in 1908. For many white Southern Baptists of this era, racism went hand in hand with their faith. Some Wake Forest students were also supportive of white supremacist terror. Indeed, one young man at the college was arrested for his involvement in the KKK. In 1871, United States Marshal and 6 officers detained David S. Ramser while he was in a Wake Forest Literary Society meeting. Ramser was a native of Cleveland County, North Carolina, and he had been part of the KKK raid the previous December in South Carolina. His group had attacked, shot, and cut the throat of a black man named Thomas Roundtree. According to one newspaper, as a successful farmer and landowner, Roundtree's, quote, "prosperity excited the wrath of the Ku Klux, who determined to kill him," end quote. Ramser's arrest came as the federal government worked to suppress the KKK at this time. He was put on trial. He pled guilty to conspiracy and was sentenced to 8 years in prison in Albany, New York. While Ramser was serving his sentence, Charles Eliza Taylor, a young Latin professor at the school, former Confederate veteran, and future president of Wake Forest, spoke out on his behalf in an 1872 letter published in a Virginia Baptist newspaper. Ramser's father also pleaded to President Grant to pardon his son. David Ramser was granted his release. And for the 1873-1874 academic year, the faculty at Wake Forest allowed him to return. Account records from the time show that he brought a pistol with him, and the college bursar recorded his possession of the weapon in his account records. In the post-war period, Ramser was not alone in keeping a firearm at the school, as a number of other students did this into the early 1900s. Several years after Ramser, Thomas Dixon Jr. began his studies at Wake Forest. Dixon, considered one of Wake Forest's most famous alumni in the late 1800s and early 1900s, later arguably its most notorious graduate, got his start as a student speaking and writing when the literary societies on campus were in their heyday in the late 1800s. Actually, Dixon, when COVID began, I was working on this project and I began to read the Wake Forest Student. It started in the 1880s. That was a good way to pass some time. It's lengthy. Something like 900 pages a year. And it goes for decades. Never ending. Dixon published some of his earliest work by contributing essays to the Wake Forest Student that had recently begun publication. His first 2 pieces, though, I am very certain that he published under a pseudonym. And the pseudonym is Mac A. last name Fee. I believe strongly that McAfee is this name, which is a tribute to his uncle Leroy McAfee, a figure Dixon greatly admired. Leroy McAfee was a Confederate colonel and a leader in the Cleveland County KKK. Dixon's first article, Trouble on the Campus, it described 2 Wake Forest students tracking down a man who had escaped from an asylum and was on the grounds. The young men with guns in tow pursued and captured the unnamed intruder. The story, in effect, started a theme that Dixon would return to in his later writings. vigilante white men handling affairs on their own. Dixon's next article under this pseudonym came out the following year, was entitled From College to Prison, The Invisible Empire. It was his rendering of the David Ramsar story. Dixon outlines a young man's arrest at Wake Forest, his trial, imprisonment, and weaves in a love story. The last part's an element he would employ in other work. The tale reveals Dixon's admiration for the Klan, and he goes as far as putting into the character's mouth these words, quote, "I believe the existence of that order, for a time at least, was absolutely necessary for the protection of our homes, our characters, and our lives." Unquote. The story ends with the main character released from prison and just engaged to be married. Dixon made him a hero. In his books on the later books on the KKK and Reconstruction, he would follow similar patterns. Dixon graduated in 1883 with his Master's of Arts and received a host of awards at Wake Forest. From there, he went on to Johns Hopkins to study history and politics, and then he pursued a variety of careers: acting, law, government, ministry, and then turned to writing. Among his books are the famous trilogy, The Leopard Spots, The Klansman, and The Traitor, published in the early 1900s. These works glorified the KKK and presented Reconstruction as being a time of a disaster. At Wake Forest in the early 1900s, Dixon was received well for his writings. In 1903, there's an update in one of the publications about alumni news. And the alumni news notes that The Leopard Spots had sold 94,000 copies. And it went on to say, quote, "The book is a faithful presentation of the race problem in the South," unquote. A year later, the editors of Wake Forest yearbook, The Howler, they dedicated that edition to Dixon and said, quote, "Of all her sons, Wake Forest has none who has reflected more honor upon his alma mater," unquote. In the coming decades, Dixon returned several times to Wake Forest for campus events. During Dixon's undergraduate years at Wake Forest, he made one other contribution that deserves noting. He was instrumental in forming the school's first fraternity. In 1881, members of Davidson College's Kappa Alpha Order helped start the Tau chapter of this organization at Wake Forest. Originally created at Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, this fraternity had spread quickly throughout southern white colleges. At Wake Forest, Dixon was among the 5 charter members. The faculty soon found out about this fraternity. There were some others that tried to be started. They tried to stop them. Until the 1920s, the faculty did not officially recognize these fraternities, and there were starts and stops to some of them. After the Civil War, Wake Forest continued to hire black men to do similar work as their enslaved counterparts had previously been forced to do. College records also continued to refer to these employees by that same term before the Civil War, college servants. Along with those men, the school also hired some black men as day laborers. They handled such tasks as cutting firewood, hauling work, campus and grounds care. The account records for 1867 reveal that George Alston was hired as this college servant. Alston apparently was illiterate, having made his mark to acknowledge receiving his wages. Following him, Ralph Peace took that role for several years, and he was likely the same man or a relative of the one who had been at the college in the antebellum period. He also made his mark when he received his wages, indicating he was probably literate as well. These men were followed by a series of other black college employees who worked for briefer periods in the 1870s. In the 1880s, Wake Forest began to grow in enrollment in its physical plant, and a larger group of black men came to work there, including Lynn Crenshaw, Thomas Land, and Thomas Jeffries. Crenshaw worked for nearly a decade. Land's employment extended to 16 years. Students frequently made references to these men in the Wake Forest Student, often making fun of them. I'll give you an example of a reference to Crenshaw. This appeared in 1889. Quote, Professor Lynn Crenshaw, who presides with great dignity over the chair of bell ringing, like the patriotic citizen that he is, has recently added considerably to the list of the census. He's had twins, end quote. Referring to the black college employees as, quote, professor, continued in the coming years, but this title carried a tone of mockery to these men, many of whom may have been illiterate. Thomas Jeffries also served for a lengthy period at Wake Forest. Indeed, of all the black employees in this period, he toiled the longest. He remained there from the 1880s through the 1920s, 1927 when he died. His story and life at Wake Forest is important to understand the institution's history, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later. Along with the black male workers on campus, local boarding houses employed black women in the post-war period as well. These women cooked student meals, washed their clothes, cleaned their living spaces. Many of the faculty who had homes very close to campus had black women who served there as domestic help. That actually continued until the move of Wake Forest to Winston-Salem. In the late 1800s, the college began to expand. They added buildings, they increased their endowment. At the turn of the century, they started a law and a medical school. Most of this expansion came when Charles Elijah Taylor was president. Taylor also worked to improve the grounds of the campus. It's hard to imagine, especially when thinking of the campus here today, but in the 1880s, Wake Forest, the town, was a small rural area, small population, a place where for a long time they did not even have a fence to circle the campus, and livestock roamed on it. At one point, they allowed people to have their cows on the land, and they would charge them a fee to graze there. Campus was very dilapidated in the 1880s. Under Taylor, one of the things they did is begin to improve the grounds. One of the things was the creation of a stone wall. The stone wall got built in sections. The first part of this wall was built on the eastern side of campus near the railroad tracks. That was done by Thomas Jeffries and Lynn Crenshaw. Two men were involved in this. The reason they did that first one there was because that's the one where students and visitors came as they entered from the train depot. It was also the one where trains passed by. And in the time, if you read the records, students often complained that the campus didn't look good to passing trains going by. Along the rock wall, the college grounds also received other upgrades. They planted hundreds of trees, vines, and shrubs, including the famous magnolias. And Thomas Jeffries was involved in these projects. Like some of the other black college employees from the late 1800s, students at some point, they began to refer to Jeffries as Professor Tom. For example, in 1895, the Wake Forest student reported, quote, our dusky professor of horticulture, with the assistance of our similarly complexioned professor of bell ringing, is devoting his energies to the shrubs and trees of the campus, end quote. In this period, when black people are mentioned, almost always there is some reference to their race and the use of this kind of language of dusky or colored. Around 1900, students and faculty shifted from calling Thomas Jeffries Professor Tom to Dr. Tom. Thomas Jeffries was not originally from Wake Forest. He had been born enslaved before the Civil War in a county in Mecklenburg County, Virginia. It appears around 1880 he came to Wake Forest. It is not clear what brought him there. In the town, he first worked privately in some of the college professors' homes, and then in the early 1880s, President Taylor hired him to work for the college. Jeffries handled various tasks around the campus, including janitorial duties and grounds care. He also appeared and spoke for pep rallies, college celebrations, and special group events. For decades, references to him and what he was claimed to have said in his speeches appeared in scores of student articles, reports, joke sections of the magazine, of the yearbook, and the newspaper. In many ways, the students had come to view him as a type of mascot. Whom Jeffries was behind the mask he wore, though, it remains something of a mystery. As an illiterate black man, he left no writings of his own, and most of the information available about him comes through white writers. Students and faculty found Jeffries entertaining, particularly what he said and the way he said it. In fact, they frequently made fun of the things he said and rendered his speech in dialect. Students and college leaders considered him to accept a subordinate role and to not challenge the prevailing white supremacy of that era. In effect, these students and college leaders viewed him as a latter-day incarnation of what many white people in that era revered as the mythical, faithful slave of the Old South. Here is something that a student wrote soon after his death in the student newspaper in 1927. Quote, "Students returning to the campus after summer vacation missed the greeting of our old college janitor, Dr. Tom. He has passed away during the summer, and we shall not look upon his like again. The quaint humor, the unfailing politeness, and the chivalry of the old Southern Negro were well represented in him. We caught in him a vision of the Old South, with tall white columns, expansive fields of cotton, log cabin and singing darkies, the swinging banjo and shuffling feet." End quote. I could actually read further. That quote goes on, but it goes on in ways to be even more offensive, in ways that I would just prefer not even speak those words aloud today. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Wake Forest students frequently wrote about political topics in their magazine and newspaper. One persistent theme dealt with black voting, and the students were not in favor of it. In 1889, a student wrote in an article entitled, "What of the Negro?" commenting, quote, "For 7 million Negroes using the ballot, ignorant of its power, still blindly using it, and casting the majority vote in some states, is a sight to make men chill and angels weep over the concerns of men." End quote. By the turn of the century, students had gone beyond criticizing voting practices to calling for African Americans to be disenfranchised. 1898, John Charles McNeill wrote an editorial in the school's magazine where he wrote approvingly of the Wilmington race riot, where whites had violently overthrown the elected city government and massacred black people and driven them from town. In this piece, McNeill also commented, "Such future events would not be necessary if, quote, if the lately elected legislature does its duty, the Negro vote, which is a synonym for the ignorant vote, will largely be eliminated. The body of voters will be composed of such men as are qualified by education to exercise the right of suffrage, and in proportion as the ignorant vote is cut off, will be more intelligent and capable representatives be required." Unquote. A similar statement got made the following year by another student. This student, he felt that the best thing to do was to disenfranchise black voters. And he went on in his article to say, at the time, North Carolina had a constitutional amendment that would do just that. He said in his article, while some might think this is kind of revolutionary to do so, he said, quote, "Well, some people who are totally ignorant, and while thinking they are enjoying liberty, are then in greatest bondage. It is better to take a man's freedom from him if in the exercise of it he proves pernicious to his country's welfare." End quote. McNeill and Earp's articles were written in the context of North Carolina's Democrats' white supremacy campaign. For a brief period earlier in the 1890s, you had had a coalition of Republicans and populists who had come together for a time over shared agriculture and economic interests. They had dominated North Carolina politics. Yet white Democrats in the late 1890s, they regained power through vicious racist campaign, electoral manipulation, and violence. The party's triumph in 1898 allowed these white Democrats to move forward with disenfranchisement of African Americans through a poll tax and literacy test. By the turn of the century, there was even some student violence directed at local black people living in Wake Forest. 1899, a major snowstorm hit. The magazine, student magazine, made this comment, or this report, quote, "Snowballing was the order of the day. One young man, however, missed his aim and hit a Negro. The Negro cursed him and ran over to Miss Watson's for protection. The boys surrounded the house. Dr. Allen ran the Negro out, and there was a hot chase until he was overtaken in the street opposite Professor Cullen's. He had an axe in his hand, but some of the boys managed to tap him with sticks. He threw down the axe and led the chase across the railroad to a Negro house, receiving one or two taps as he went in, and created some excitement both among the students and the Negroes. Evidently, the occupants of the dormitory expected a Negro raid for that night when someone humorously tossed a snowball through a window. The college was soon bristling with a great variety of arms." End quote. Remember the weapons. For simply cursing the student who had hit him with a snowball, this unnamed black man is pursued by a crowd of Wake Forest students through the town. Fearful for his safety, he picks up an axe. Undoubtedly, the writer, as he tells this, is downplaying the students' actions by claiming they had only given him a few taps. How the situation ended that day is not made clear, but the level of intensity is evidenced by the fact that students were willing to take up weapons that night. White-initiated mob violence, racial mob violence, was all too common in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It took place on a large scale in Wilmington, New Orleans, Atlanta, among many other instances. This is the era of the nadir of race relations. As historian Martin Sosna notes, quote, "The years between 1890 and 1920 were in many ways the grimmest that blacks had faced since the end of slavery. Violence, disenfranchisement, and tightening segregation characterized Southern race relations." End quote. And if a black man could encounter such violence for simply speaking back to a student after being hit by a snowball, one can only imagine how difficult daily life on the campus was for Jeffries and the other black workers there. They must have been constantly walking on eggshells. It was in this period of the South that lynchings of black people reached some of their highest numbers, and it would be situations like this one, the snowball incident, which could quickly escalate into one. By the 1900s, students were trumpeting their racism. In 1903, in the first volume of the Howler, there's a section that includes county organizations from various sections of North Carolina. One of these is the Halifax County Club. They list their motto as, quote, "white supremacy forever." I was here early and I walked by the stack of the Howler, which is on the third floor. I found the copy, if you'd like to. Actually listed amongst the membership is T.D. Kitchen. Thurman D. Kitchen, who was a student at the time and future Wake Forest president. Hazing was also a common custom at the college in this period and included a practice known as, quote, blacking. Shoe polish, axle grease, ink were smeared on the faces of freshmen students to humiliate them. Usually the sophomores were the culprits because the year before they had had it done to them. Here's a poem from a freshman in the 1906 Howler, quote, "The sophomores' famous concoction, applied with their usual grace, makes us think when they're finished we belong to the African race." End quote. This blacking custom, this is also done at Chapel Hill. I have not been able to confirm it at other schools, but certainly is being done at Chapel Hill as well. By By 1905, Wake Forest looked quite different from the place it had been in 1866 or in 1834. The school had a significantly larger faculty, student body, buildings, expanded curriculum, landscape campus. They were financially on firmer foundation than ever before as well. It's hard to quite get our minds around it, but Wake Forest struggled dramatically with finances in the 19th century. It's only in the late 1800s that they really get their feet on good ground. The school's influence also was expanding through a growing alumni base. Since the Civil War, they produced numerous Baptist ministers, teachers, professors, college presidents, journalists, state and national politicians. And with the creation of their law and medical school, they were turning out more and more physicians and lawyers. Yet some things remain the same at Wake Forest. As a Baptist college in the South, the majority of its students were members of that denomination and came from rural and small town backgrounds. As had been the case since 1839, many of them took their meals in local boarding houses. There's no campus dining hall. That doesn't come until decades later. Wake Forest also remained a teaching-focused institution. Faculty published little. They had to teach so much and their administrative duties were so heavy. They were not expected to publish. Like much of the white South at the time, Wake Forest also remained mired in racism, and students and faculty clung to myths about slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. African Americans continued to handle the domestic and maintenance work that was necessary for the college's functioning, and all too often were the brunt of student and faculty derision. Local African Americans also had to live with the risk of physical violence from students. The next quarter of a century, we begin to see some changes, but my research has shown me that racism was one of the slowest things to change at the college. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
I had a question about the living situation at the time for the enslaved and then later the employed black workers there. I know there were boarding houses later, but initially, were they sleeping in the same area as the students?
I can do this.
Sure.
I think they have some people on a live stream.
Yeah, absolutely. So my question was about the living situation for the enslaved and then later the employed black workers there.
In the antebellum period, it's not real clear where the enslaved workers are living. Probably in some of the homes, maybe a separate outbuilding. The early campus, in the first years of the school, they don't have a college building. They build that in the first 5 years of the school. And so they're using the former Calvin Jones house, as well as some outbuildings and then some cabins. Probably somewhere there, but that's not made clear in the records. Following the period of emancipation, what happens in Wake Forest, you have segregated housing. Basically, in that piece I mentioned about the snowball incident, they talk about going over to the black section of town. There is an area of the town that becomes primarily African American. And those people who live there, when they work for the college, they will walk over to the campus, or they walk to the homes of the professors where they work.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So many questions. We can talk later. Ramser presumably writes a letter from the Albany prison cell, although I know what you just said, and so we have Pascal who claims that he's decided it actually was the kid who wrote it, and you have Pate later in the 50s who does this independent research who decides the same thing. So I'm reading the damn thing and I'm saying, this sounds like Dixon, who happens to be the editor of the yearbook at that time, of the student, and it reads in this sort of embellished thing. So I'm thinking it's Dixon. And I make that claim, but I don't have any basis for it. I can't find anything that proves that. How do you know that?
I do not know 100%, but it did seem to add up. the name McAfee clearly has a significance of his uncle. Also, there's a
That name's not on that article.
Trouble in the Campus,
No, well, yeah, but not on the one that.
the David Ramser. We'll have to, we can both look. It has been a little while since I was in that particular source.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
Lynn Lyerly is writing a biography of Thomas Dixon. She was a part of the Dixon conference here years ago. She's a Rice graduate. I called her. It was not easy to get her on the phone a year or so ago, and I had that theory that McAfee was actually Dixon. She said yes.
It makes me read like that.
Yeah. So that's her theory. That her book has not come out yet.
That's what I said in the draft.
Other questions?
You can just repeat it. So I've always heard that Wake, one of the reasons that it was on unsteady financial footing is because it invested in the Confederate bonds. Is that true? And were other colleges doing that as well in the South?
So she asked a question about why Wake Forest was on unsteady grounds and whether it had to do with the fact they invested in Confederate bonds during the Civil War. It's complicated. Their own, before the Civil War, arguably they are in hard economic times. When they first start the school, they pay off the debt of the land, but then they build a college building. That building costs us maybe $10,000 or $20,000. They can't pay that off for years, so that's a debt. They can't pay professor salaries for a while. By the 1850s, they begin to get some bequests in wills. Some of this is property, some of these are enslaved people that they sell, and that helps the endowment. During the Civil War, most of the money in the endowment was invested in Confederate bonds, but not entirely everything. So they do come out with a little bit of money after the end of the war. Then in the years, I'd say the 1860s and 70s, they're still struggling for money. They get some money from the North by the 70s and 80s, including about $100,000 from a man connected to Standard Oil, Bostwick.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So yes, they did invest in the Confederate.
Yes.
Yes. I had the same question, but my other question is about Crenshaw, the black servant predecessor of Tom Jeffries. Are we to assume, or do you know, that he is of William Crenshaw, first treasurer of Wake Forest and extensive enslaver, and then got that last name from that ownership?
I don't have enough information to know. There's limited information in the records of students. I did look him up in the census. You can follow some of that in 1870, 1880. He dies around 1890. I don't have enough information to know if he is related to that Crenshaw family.
Not related to previously owned.
Sure. Yes. No, I don't have any hard evidence.
On YouTube, Deacon 87 says it's great to see racial issues directly addressed. Every institution should take the same approach, and then they ask, are most alumni appreciative of your work?
The ones that I've shared research with, I think so. I've given a couple of these kind of talks, but I expect it may just not be widely known. The project, I've been working on it for 7 years. I expect I've written over 400 pages. I expect I've got another 50, 75 to finish a draft. I hope that I can get to a press next summer. It can be published in a couple of years. I think I'll be able to answer your question better after that. Yeah.
I don't mean to dominate, sorry.
Just kind of newly to some of these weeds. Dr. Tom, you describe in the end your take on it is, Well, we were pretty damn racist, and the school stays pretty damn racist, even post-Pete and other faculty fighting and everything else. It stays racist well until the 1930s, and even longer, really, 50s and 40s, but this, that's a different game. Dr. Tom gets invited to speak all across the state. He dies and everybody loves him as the biggest funeral ever in Wake Forest history, and the congregations, the black and white churches are there, and he is in celebration. And I don't think the only takeaway is that well, he just used him because he was to represent the slave for them. There's also this notion of what's happening in the rhetoric at this time, the oratories of the time, the debates of the time, which are racist as heck. They'll curl your hair. But they also have enlightened parts, and they talk about the New South and the revival and what to do with Negroes that are reasonable in the sense of the times, etc. So I think this painting it as this, oh my God, this all proves how awful everybody was. True, they were awful, but that isn't the only story that was going on. Is that fair?
You make a comment that he's speaking it all across the state. I don't know that I have seen that in the primary source record. Well, we can speak.
He went and spoke at the Alumni Associations for Wake Forest across the state. They invited him to speak.
He almost, everywhere he speaks, there's sort of a myth that develops that he spoke at commencement.
He spoke at a pre-ceremony commencement 3 days before.
He speaks,
Several years.
he speaks, I mean, dozens of times. He appears in the record scores of times over about 4 decades. He does not give chapel talks. He does not speak before formal events. He is usually speaking, and the way it gets reported in the papers, as it's entertainment. He speaks to, there's students come back from a victory of a major debate, a meeting that they all come on campus and they're celebrating, and he gets up and speaks. He speaks.
They wait for him to get to his wall so he can do the big grand thing. And the students seem to bluff him oftentimes. In other words, this may be mascot, but sometimes they actually like people.
Yeah, I do agree. There's some people who would have had some real affection for him, but overwhelmingly he is often demeaned. The dialect, which his language is often rendered in.
Oh, it's true.
It's not to raise him in a respectful way. There's a joke to the students about it. His death. So there's some mythology around his burial and his ceremony. When he dies in 1927, they do have his funeral on the campus. It does not take place, though, in the white Wake Forest Baptist Church. It takes place in the chapel, which is on the campus at the time, Wingate Memorial, who's named after President Wingate. Some people have argued that, or they have said that this is an integrated gathering. Well, if you read the reports from the time, they segregated whites and blacks within the sanctuary, whites on one side, black people on another. There's also reports that the faculty were his pallbearers. They were his honorary pallbearers. The records from the time will show that the people who moved his body are actually the other black college employees who handled the physical moving. So that story can be told in ways that make it seem different. Yeah. I'll say this one last thing about Jeffries. There was, I think this is in the Biblical Recorder, this is the State Baptist Magazine newspaper. They print information about Jeffries' death and burial, and they precede it with these words. Something like, quote, this is to show about the good relationship between whites and blacks in the South. So they're using that in a certain way. So that, I guess I could go on
I
that.
agree with all that. what extent do you think Thomas, because Dr. Tom in survival mode, that part of his dialogue set, which was authentic itself, but kind of over the time again, was performance.
I think
it's that he knew what he was doing, he worked it good, but I mean, not for him. Survival. I understand all the things you're saying. I agree with that. I think there's good people too.
Other questions, because we're nearly out of time.
Anybody else?
The last burning question.
Thank you, Andrew. Oh, we have one?
You have something? I thought I saw something.
I have a question. What's left to do, Andrew, with the book?
Yeah. I basically don't use this much. I basically have written 5 chapters which cover up through 1930. So the last chapter will cover from 30 to 1956. So for me, I read every article, every issue of the Old Gold and Black from 1916 to 1956. I read every Howard, read nearly every Wake Forest student. It's an immense amount of stuff. I need to read the trustee records for that period, but at this point it's just I need a block of time to kind of sit down and to kind of push through on that. So the last part, I need to review some of the presidential papers, the Kitchen administration, the Tribble administration. Kitchen actually does not get a lot of attention in real depth in Pascal or Bynum Shaw. So I need to do some work there. Yes.
My question, so I'm interested in the impact that athletics, collegiate athletics has had on desegregation, or I guess like just the way those things intersect. Particularly here, I know that I think it was Tribble, he faced a lot of backlash from alumni in the community when they decided to integrate the football team. Do you think you'll cover a lot of that as you move forward?
I will not get into, I'm going to try to, plans to cut it off in 1956. And so integration, I think it's 1962 or something here. I will mention this on top of athletics. There was something that comes up in the student newspaper, maybe the 19-teens, and Washington and Lee was playing a school, maybe Jefferson College or something from the north. And Washington and Lee decided not to play them because they had a black man who was a fullback. And Wake Forest reported on that, and they said, we are in hearty sympathy with Washington and Lee. The idea of playing would have implied social equality, and they said they did not think that appropriate, and so they agreed that Washington and Lee had chosen not to play. But I will not get to really the period you're talking about with the football integration. Okay, thank you very much.
Please, receptionist for refreshments and water.
Yeah, I read it. I like your phone.
Get along?